Welcome to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And this is the podcast where we explore the theories that are going to change the world. And today we are talking consciousness. Specifically, we are talking about the fact that perhaps the hard problem of consciousness is not actually a problem that we have to wrestle with. In brief, the hard problem of consciousness is this philosophical conundrum. How is it that organisms with brains have internal experiences, but organisms without brains do not? There's something unique and special that philosophers think emerges inside of humans that gives us the ability to have the sensation of seeing a beautiful sunset, of smelling a cup of coffee, of enjoying the taste of chocolate. And our guest today, James Cooke, who wrote a book called The Dawn of Mind, is proposing that perhaps placing the boundary of consciousness at the emergence of brains, specifically brains that look like human brains, is perhaps a futile affair. And the entire universe starts to make a whole lot more sense if you assume that consciousness and life emerge together and are absolutely inseparable.
James is speaking with us from Portugal, which is interesting because we are headed to Portugal very soon for our Beyond the Big Bang conference in Sesimbra, and we would love to see you there. It's going to be an absolutely magnificent and historical event where we're bringing together all sorts of minds to tackle the problem of what comes after the Big Bang, including people who want to see another Big Bang come after the Big Bang. And if you're not familiar with the story that goes into this, check out some of the other podcasts recently, including our conversation with Engin Albanik, who is a standard cosmologist. Also, we've been on a few other podcasts recently, including Chris Lito's channel, Simon Holland's channel, and we've laid out the crisis in cosmology, so be sure to check those out. I can link them down in the description. It's going to be an incredible weekend of talks at a seaside resort, and you can join us. So come over and check out your options at getting into the Demysticon project, because the more the merrier, and we would love to not only have you visit and be in the audience, but also present your own ideas. We are opening up all members, people who come to this society meeting, to present a poster of their ideas, and it's going to be an incredibly collaborative space that I think you're going to want to be part of.
If traveling to Portugal is too much of a stretch, then there is something else that I do want to ask you to do, which is support us on patreon.com/demystifysci. It is incredibly, incredibly important that if you like what we do and you listen to our episodes every week, that you contribute to keeping the show running. I really wish that we lived in a world where we could survive without having any money for the electrical bill and the internet bill, and that we could just photosynthesize our way through the world and devote ourselves fully and completely to examining philosophical topics the way that we do on this show. But the world does not work that way, and we survive at the mercy of your support. We don't want to put ads on this podcast. We don't want to start selling you things that you don't need. We believe that it's possible to host interesting conversations with people that you want to hear us talking to simply as a function of the support of our audience. So again, I really humbly request that you come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and sign up to give us $1, $2 a month, because if you can do that, that means that we can continue working on this project and making it better and better and better for you.
Maybe you also have your own theory that you want to share with the world too, and we have a new segment going on once a month called Paradigm Drift, where you get a chance to be entered into a drawing to present your ideas live at our newest show. And I would love to see you there, so check out the signups down below for Paradigm Drift. Otherwise, enjoy the conversation with James Cooke, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I can't tell you how excited I am for this conversation, because you gave us your book, The Dawn of Mind, and I read through most of it. I didn't read through all of it, but you are probably one of the first people that I have come across who is like, hey, I don't necessarily think that there is a hard problem of consciousness. And this is the way that we can work around that. And Shiloh insisted before we sat down that I bring everybody else along with this, which is that the hard problem of consciousness, as far as I understand it, is the question of how did brains become conscious? And that's always seemed like a very weird formulation of the question. It feels like your book is confirming that that is a particularly strange formulation of the question, which creates the question in the first place, because it seems like life and consciousness are immutable. Like, you cannot separate those two things out. Did I satisfy your preferences for this introduction?
That was a very long and windy and winding road.
It was. Do you want to put it into
It is great.
words for us?
I just see it as, if what we're talking about is whether consciousness arises in humans and that's the problem that needs to be explained, that's somehow a different usage of the word consciousness than this primordial awareness that we see in all sorts of living beings. And so Nastia, I don't know as much about this as Nastia. She spends a lot of time arguing with people on Twitter about analytic idealism. But it seems to me that if the hard problem is about consciousness in general, this awareness, then that's a strange question indeed.
Right.
Then what Nastia says, there is no hard problem, becomes an interesting point.
Okay, we're making a hash of this. So perhaps where we could start is, James, do you want to give us the lay of the land for what consciousness is and what people are talking about when they're trying to study it, even before we get to the hard problem?
Yeah. So I think everything you both said was really helpful there. So yeah, you're right, Shallow, to point out that it really matters what we mean by consciousness. Because if you say to someone, the word consciousness could conjure up feelings, ideas of some like human being philosopher standing out under the stars, contemplating their existence, deeply, the ability to kind of cogitate on these profound issues, and that's not really what we're talking about. That's more to do with more complex functions of the mind, but consciousness, as we're talking about it, where there's this philosophical and scientific issue, is really bare feeling. Awareness is a great word you used. If the lights are on, is a way to kind of gesture towards it. If something is conscious, if it's just a clockwork automaton, if it's a rock that doesn't feel anything when you kick it, if it's like a clock is a good example. We suspect there's nothing. Typically, we suspect there's nothing it feels like to be the mechanism of a clock, right? So, if there's something it feels like to be something, if there's any inner world, if there's any experience, subjectivity, all of these words point to this phenomenon of consciousness. And it's qualitative as well, like the quality of pain, the quality of redness. Pain doesn't come in neat kind of metrics, like quantitative measurements, like in space and time. So you've got this kind of quantitative world, seemingly, that science studies. And then we've got this inner world of things like pain and redness and coffee taste. And that's quite hard to come up with similar, it doesn't seem to be quantitative in the same way. So this is this does bring us on to the hard problem. So in the most kind of broad way.
Before we go to the hard problem, I'm sorry
Mm-hmm.
to interrupt you. Before we
go
to the hard problem, are we all understanding how we're using the word consciousness in this context? Because I do think it's worth belaboring, because so many of these podcasts about consciousness don't define the terms, and I like how you've put it, but are you following this? Are you 100% on the definition of consciousness?
Yeah, I think so. It's the raw sensation of experience. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good definition. Yeah, and I mean, you're right to linger on this, because we actually can't really... Every definition gets cashed out against another definition, so we can only really gesture towards it. We can't say bang, here it is on paper. It's kind of a loop of it's like experience, which is like qualitative sensations, which is like feeling, so all we can really do is, but everyone knows this. Everyone knows what consciousness is in a very bare sense in terms of the blue of the sky, unless you're an automaton who can't see the blue of the sky. Or, if someone like that wouldn't even be hearing my voice now. So the ability to these sounds, this bare sensation, as you said, it's like simple experience. And it's important we kind of, keep to this definition throughout. Awareness is interesting, because I would say awareness is a core aspect, but you can it's almost the illumination quality, the fact that it's not happening in the dark. So you could say you've got the contents of consciousness, which could be my voice, the sound of a cat, taste of coffee, but all of those share this illumination. There's a kind of knowingness, you could say. When you see the blue of the sky, there's a knowing that there's a blue of the sky. When there's not consciousness, there's not a knowingness. So when you're in deep dreamless sleep, you don't know if there's anything going on. You don't, there's just not that knowingness, that awareness. So it is important to keep that in mind. They're not truly separable, but they are kind of two facets of what we're talking about here.
And as we pivot into the hard problem, are there people that think organisms without brains don't have raw experience? Is that an argument that's being...
The case I'm making is that life and consciousness go together, so you don't need a brain to be conscious. That seems a very radical position to take at the moment. The idea that it's something to do with nervous systems, something to do with brains, is so taken for granted that it's, I like that you guys are both smiling as if, you were on the same team perhaps here. Because to me, that's the case I make in the book, is that it's an unjustified assumption that it comes into existence with brains.
It's just such a relief to hear you say that.
Well, yeah, I think that it's on all of us to defend why that seems so obvious to us also, I guess, because, in order to do that, I think I really want to linger and understand why people don't believe that that is the case. Because for me, of course, I see any organism orienting towards some goal that it has, whether it's a bacterium trying to move towards a chemical gradient or a human trying to solve a math problem. I can't help but see an awareness, a subjective experience guiding that vision towards the future version of what it wants to be.
Which is clearly not the same awareness in all organisms, but the idea that there isn't some bare germ of it that comes with the most basic form of something that we would call alive has always... I haven't found anybody that has given me a satisfactory explanation for why you wouldn't connect the emergence of awareness with the emergence of life as being part and parcel, specifically actually because of something that Shiloh said, because it seems like it's a question of being able to have preferences that drive you towards something. And so the entire mystery of life seems to boil down to the fact that life emerges alongside of a will, and in order for the will to manifest, you have to have awareness of being able to look at the landscape, and instead of just saying, well, nothing matters, say, okay, well, there's these things that I want to orient towards myself and move. And clearly humans have this insane frame where the things we orient towards are just inexplicable and esoteric to most other living beings. But it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree, it seems like.
Yeah, I love the language you're both using for this, because it completely captures the point of this, the way that it's a necessary part of what organisms do as phenomena that have to kind of keep themselves going in the world. They're not these little clockwork automata that evolution could just set going and then they just bumble along like little mechanisms. They're kind of, I would say, rather than fixed objects or fixed mechanisms, they are evolutionary processes. They are these processes that are discovering how to be in the world. And that's kind of why there needs to be this coupling to the world. There needs to be, as you said, I'm repeating kind of what you both said there about ability to orient, to navigate, to have significance. All of that stuff comes along for the ride. And, the question of why is there the assumption that it's about brains? To really unpack this in the book, I really go into a kind of historical, sociological, political critique, which goes back all the way really to agriculture and kind of, pre-agriculture, and in hunter-gatherer societies, it's very common to have animism, which is a kind of a way of relating to the world where you feel other living things to be your kin, and thereby it seems reasonable that they would have some inner world, And so that seems to be a very pervasive way of seeing the world. And then I think our material relationship with the living world, first with kind of, taking wild animals and domesticating them so that we have this kind of master-servant relationship where we kind of withdraw our empathy and we start to treat them as objects rather than subjects. And I think that starts to creep in a kind of just the way we see them. It's too painful to empathize, to see the animals that you're not treating them as if they're your relatives, you're treating them as if you own them. And so I think that starts the seed of this process of humans feeling superior, different, exceptional. And then I think with Christianity, this goes into overdrive with explicitly stating in the Bible that humans, everything on earth is for humans to use, is very explicitly stated, And Then with capitalism and Descartes and philosophers who got popularity at that time, we move into a mode of production that is entirely about extraction. Like, how can we, as humans, like and particular groups of humans, how can we extract stuff? How can we plunder nature, not treating it as a kind of generative Mother Earth who we should respect, but as this object to be extracted from? I think all of that leads to us fallible humans having just these background assumptions of like, well, that's the way the world is. We don't have to respect nature. It's not, even though we know factually there's a single family tree of life and we are literally related to a banana tree. Like they're part of our extended family. We don't feel that in our culture. Like we're not encouraged to see things that way. So I think it goes back a long time. And I think it's not just problematic for philosophy and for understanding ourselves and for science. It's like for our entire mode of being. I think it's a kind of egoic neurosis, a collective ego about kind of humans just wanting this kind of there's a Native American term, I think it was the Algonquin, had this term wetiko for this like mind virus that the kind of European colonizers, they said, had, which was just this kind of insatiable need to consume, this kind of, and I think wetiko, when I read about that, it feels like that's the same thing I'm pointing to here, this kind of rampage of collective ego of me, more, like, and it shows up in this fundamental issue of how we see ourselves, and we think we must be special in some way. We have to be exceptional. We can't just be like other living things. We have to come up with some story that makes us feel really good about why we behave the way we do. It can only be because it's just like narcissism, basically, like some kind of positive story we tell ourselves.
Can I play the psycho-objectivist and just say, like, is that a bad thing? Like, what's so bad about us having human supremacy and extracting the hell out of everything? Like, I know it's an absurd question, but I think that the answer is actually pretty complex.
Yeah.
Did you coin a term psycho-objectivist here, or it is like a psychotic objectivist?
Psycho is in psychotic, correct?
Okay. Because I was like,
it's deeply cold and uncompassionate, but
right.
I do value compassion, but there's a reason that I value compassion, and I value harmony, like this ecological harmony, but I want to see if we can unpack it a little bit.
No, I love that question. So as I unpack this in the book, the whole thing of turning subjects into objects, I use the example of a psychopath where I say, our current economies are based around instrumental value to the exclusion of other kinds of value. Humans value clean air and clean drinking water, but that value isn't actually priced in to our economic models. It's just how much instrumental value, how much power, how much agency, how much can this extend the agency of the people who have the keys to the system. And that logic is like, if you said, big rocks have instrumental value if you want to build a stepping stone bridge across a river. And to a psychopath, they could say, well, human bodies, I could kill a bunch of humans and arrange them into a bridge. And they're not wrong in their logic. Like, if all you care about is instrumental value, the person who says, please don't do that, that's kind of crazy, like that's not a good thing to do, on a kind of purely rational level, you actually do have a difficult case to make there. And so that is a really good question. It's kind of your word against them if they're seeing it from their own perspective. And so you mentioned harmony, and to me that is what this comes down to, is that what's truly the true choice here is localized power in the sense of you're increasing your own agency, instrumental value, power. And I think what we see is that leads to disharmony. That leads to, again, the kind of polycrisis that we currently face, where because you're creating a fundamental separation where you're not staying coupled, you're not relating in a kind of, you could say, a wise way. Wisdom here being the ability to see beyond your immediate needs or desires to something that's more harmonious in the long term. That's how we use the word wisdom, right? If you say to a kid, it's not wise to eat ice cream for breakfast, you're pointing towards kind of long-term negative consequences if they do that. So I think it's like a love of, you could say, what I would advocate for, because I value harmony personally, is that people discover a love of wisdom in that sense, which, is ironically is what philosophy means, like kind of, but I guess philosophy here more than an academic sense of just wisdom of how we show up in the world. And deeper than that, what motivates philosophy, I think, philosophia, love of wisdom, is really kind of like philharmonia, like love of harmony. And so in myself, that's the deepest pull, is that love for harmonious, because like a disharmony feels like suffering, and suffering by definition feels bad. Like if something feels good, you can't label that suffering, really, I would say. It's kind of by definition, suffering feels bad. So that's really what
Can
it
I
comes
just
down
say,
to.
like, the word psycho, the psychopath, right? It's a disorder by which somebody is. It's clearly, it has the word path. It's a pathology, so it's something that's
Right.
bad on its face. It's something that needs to be cured, right? And the way that we define, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm pretty sure the way we define psychopaths is that they don't obey the social contract. So almost
Right.
by definition, they're not agreeing to live by the harmonic rules that we've set up in order to govern our existence. And the reason that we've set those harmonic rules up is because we recognize that our only chance at survival is one another, and we have to interact in this productive fashion. So if you're a psycho, you're not contributing to that bigger meta project that's going on.
Yeah. So I think really, I guess the most robust case I can make here is that selfish dynamic. Cancer analogies are overused, but there is a point here where like a cancer in an organism is doing this self-serving dynamic, extracting from the system around it to keep itself going. And you're right that if the system were to pathologize that cancer, it's kind of its word against the cancer to some extent. It's like, by our norms, your behavior is bad, and by the cancer's norms, it's good. Except for the fact that the cancer's aim is its own self-perpetuation, but it's self-undermining because it kills the host organism. And
That's
so
the
actually,
key.
it's a futile, it's an inconsistent, ignorant way of being, you could say. I don't know what the right word is. But that's kind of what, by destroying the biosphere from underneath us in this kind of immediate craving of power, it's not going to end in any way that's good by anyone's measure, basically. So I think that is this kind of like ontological ontology that we live in is like, there's something, again, but even there, maybe we're pointing to disharmony again, and hypocrisy maybe is the word. Or
I
inconsistency.
have so many different directions in which I want to take this, and I have so many thoughts that arise as
Take
I
your
listen.
time. I mean, before we move on to the hard problem, do you have any thoughts on the human supremacy situation? I know it's something that's near and dear to your heart.
I have so many thoughts that I feel like will never hit the hard problem of consciousness if I put them down.
That's okay.
Okay, so I love that you begin this story so far back, where you're not pointing to, well, in the 1700s, they started thinking about brains, and now we have the hard problem of consciousness. You're like, no, this seems to be so deeply entrenched because it is a reflection of some cultural shift we made that allowed us to build basically civilization and empires. And colonialism and the subjugation of the animal world and the extraction of natural resources, you're like, we have built what we have on the basis of having made this split. And so perhaps it is unsurprising that the philosophers that are the product of this culture are preoccupied with figuring out, like, where did this specialness come from? And so I immediately go to a couple of different questions, because at first I was like, okay, well, is this a side effect of atheism? And then I was like, it's not exactly a side effect of atheism. It's almost a side effect of religious faith of any kind, because those religious faiths elevate the human over the animal. Like you said, this thing where it's explicit that the earth is there for our taking. And then I immediately start to think, okay, well, if you have a culture that breaks that boundary, and so basically says that all is sacred, you immediately run into a crazy condition, because it leads to either directly extinction very quickly, or it leads to the embracing of the fact that actually the optimal amount of killing is not zero. Because if all of a sudden everything is sacred and contains the same moral valence, you end up in a position where you have to say, okay, well, I don't believe in the killing of other creatures. I can't kill the mushroom to eat it, or the plant, or the cow, or anything else. Ergo, since I can't photosynthesize, this is the eventual destruction of the human project. And then on the other side, if everything is sacred, you have to say, okay, well then it is in my nature to kill.
Right.
And I live simply at the service of that. And that just kind of starts to break the cell apart, because I imagine where does it go? Like if we break this thing that has supported us for so long, what happens to humans?
Yeah, you've really kind of, sorry, Shai, do you want to come in before I answer to that?
I can just see the gears in his head.
Yeah, it's okay. Please go ahead.
Okay, the way you set that up was great, because I would say my answer is that there is this dialectic between these two extremes: complete self-negation to the point where the human species goes extinct because we refuse to, eat a mushroom, through to, although caveat there is I don't think fruit comes to harm by us eating it. I think it's kind of built into the system that it kind of wants to be eaten, if you want to anthropomorphize it. But that, we're not all just going to eat fruit. So then the other extreme, where we currently have, and I would say we're on an extreme at this point. So what I advocate for is a kind of dialectical balance between these two extremes, which is again why it comes down to wisdom, in terms of you have to want that wisdom. You have to want to show up in the world in a balanced way because you feel in your bones like that's good for some reason. You can't legislate that. You can't finger wag and tell people to do that. People have to kind of discover that for themselves, that to glimpse that wisdom and see this kind of sustainable, harmonious way of being that lies on the other side of putting it into action. And so a lot of kind of philosophical traditions, particularly spiritual ones, have this emphasis on some middle way. The middle way is a big term in Buddhism. In Nawa, Indigenous American philosophy, they speak about walking on the slippery earth, as in everything we have to find this kind of balance in the middle between sliding off to one extreme or the other. And I think here, the term I use in the book for this is what I call deep ecological humanism. So deep ecology is this view that we're pointing to, that we are not above nature, we are part of nature. We are kin with all other living things. And the reason I tack the humanism on the end there is to point to this balance, because there are elements within deep ecology, it sounds like this very nice progressive thing, but then you actually get into eco-fascism, where you have people who are like, we shouldn't do anything to save people in the global south from pandemics because that's just nature regulating itself, and who cares if millions of people die? And because there's this sense of this kind of anti-human sentiment. And so to me, that someone advocating that isn't demonstrating the kind of love of harmony that I personally have. So I think it's okay to have your preferences as a human, to not pretend that you're a fish or an apple or something else that has its own priorities. I mean, not that apples have their priorities, but apple trees. And so, again, I look at Indigenous traditions where it's very common to have rituals around sacrificing an animal. If you hunt an animal, it's not the Native Americans didn't hunt animals. They did, but they did it respectfully, with a sense of, a ritual around it, and the use of, the kind of wide, using as much of the animal as possible. Also a kind of understanding that you consume the animal today, and then when you die, your nutrients become the grass that it will feed. It will feed on. And so there's this circularity. So it comes down to reciprocity, horizontality, relationality, basically a circle worldview instead of like a kind of linear or a hierarchical worldview.
If you're cooperating with the ecosystem that you're surrounded by and embedded in, if you're cooperating with the earth, as hippie as that sounds, it's a lot less scary of a relationship to have than one where you have to be constantly fighting it to pull the resources out of it. Like you hear these indigenous communities talk about hunting where the deer just give themselves up, right? So they tend the forest and they keep it safe for the deer, essentially. Or shepherds are the same way, who are tending their flock. Like they ideally give the animal a really safe space to exist in for most of its life. And the animal might give them some wool. Eventually it might give its life so that we can eat. But it's not this relationship where it's really a partner in the process, as opposed to being something to be, battled against.
Yeah, and I think what you said there about fear is really interesting as well, because the sense of a kind of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, at least the impression I had from education, was that, that way of life is one of fundamentally feeling kind of small and alienated, under attack, fearful, exposed. Whereas, when you look at the mythology of a lot of these cultures, you see recurring things like believing that the stars are the campfires of the ancestors and stuff like that. So you imagine you're around the campfire looking up at the stars. Suddenly the whole cosmos feels like a home, like you're around the hearth with so it's, and then seeing animals as sure things to be wary of and to know how to relate with them. But it seems to me, that we project this kind of egoic, fearful, under attack, alienated, separate psychology onto basically everything where it doesn't need to actually be there.
So, oh man, that's so interesting, because I immediately start to connect this to conversations that we've had about the possibility that there were relatively advanced civilizations on Earth before ours. And even if you don't take that to be the case, and you just look at the arrival of the Western colonists to the Americas, and have you read Charles Mann's book, 1491?
No.
He makes this really compelling case for the fact that by the time that the first explorers arrived with their raiding parties to the Americas, the population of the Americas had declined already by 90% from pandemics that had started from a prior moment of contact, I think like 10 years before. And so the colonists arrived to a continent that has been emptied completely of its people. And so
except for the toughest, baddest mofos, and like the real scrappy types. Like if you think about who would survive in your neighborhood if 90% of the people were wiped out, it's like...
Exactly. And so then you have this continent that has just been completely emptied of its guardians and its people and the ones who knew how to relate to the land, facing an onslaught from people that have been living in Europe in these like very dense enclaves on a continent that's been more or less taken away from nature already, to a place where all of a sudden they have to confront it for the first time. And that's this place of like real visibility of the principles at play. And the reason that I started thinking about this in context of the ancient civilizations is where you're like, well, we seem to have had this thing from the very first moments where we separated ourselves from these animist hunter-gatherer cultures. And I'm like, if there was a civilization that predated the one that we have today, it makes sense that in the aftermath, for a long enough period of time, you emerge to something that is at equilibrium with nature. And then you start to break away from it to, again, build this like terribly unbalanced and unstable condition.
Yeah, I'd not heard about the kind of the population decline pre the colonizers arriving. I mean, there was definitely a lot of people there and a lot of genociding going on. So I wouldn't personally minimize the the amount of. There's also a lot of storytelling around this.
Like to be clear, like the colonization completely was oriented to exterminate everyone remaining, but the people that remained, by some estimates, are 10% of who was there prior to the arrival.
Some of the estimates go to 95%.
Yeah, it's which changes which would have changed history completely if you could have had a moment where instead of being confronted by the remaining 5 or 10% that are relatively easy to conquer and bully off their lands, you're actually confronted with a way of living that has not been decimated yet.
Yeah, so there's a really interesting. There was a civilization in the what's now southern United States called Mississippi Mound culture, and they built these kind of big pyramidal mounds. And that culture, I heard a talk from the anthropologist David Graeber arguing that culture may have been kind of a situation where the point he was making was that it wasn't that Native Americans were living in some primordial state of nature that was kind of, they just hadn't thought to do hierarchy and kind of technology and stuff, but rather they tried those modes and then decided for whatever reason that this isn't working. We're going to go back to the dynamics we're talking about of reciprocity, sustainability. So I think that there's a real point to that way of living isn't what a primitive culture looks like. That's what an advanced culture looks like. A culture that has tried in unstable, self-obsessed ways of being in terms of hierarchy, and then has found, all right, well, this doesn't work. Well, also, I mean, the word sustainable, there's a reason I think we see these ways of being in indigenous cultures all over the world, because they're the ones that survived. And if there were, civilizations in the past that we don't know of, it makes sense that those every kind of hierarchical, orderly civilization we know of has collapsed, and looks like we could be on the same trajectory. And actually, to be orderly is actually, in the way that we're talking about, is really the same thing as being fragile. To be kind of coupled to the world around you and decentralized is very robust. And so it makes sense that these kinds of connected, reciprocal, circular ways of being they exist over longer periods of time. In the short term, sure, maybe the colonists have guns and they can win for a while, and we can, again, like a cancer spreading, a current mode can take over the whole world, but how long is it going to last, and what's going to emerge on the other side? I would bet it would be something a lot wiser, because, again, like the cancer destroying the organism, that's not going to last for billions of years,
Seems like overly ordered civilizations, whether that's through some totalitarian fascism or some over-centrally planned government. In any case, the overordering restricts freedoms of individuals to pursue new solutions to problems. Like, you're essentially making for a stiff and brittle society that doesn't have the flexibility to adapt to what may come. And that's ultimately what takes it down in the end. And I guess that same process is playing out ecologically as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's ironic about, we live in cultures that proclaim their love of innovation, yet if you were to free up the majority of people to be innovators instead of cogs in the machine, we could have a vastly more innovative, creative world with much more, scientific discovery and artistic creation. And it's currently a very, as you say, very fragile, brittle, orderly, stratified way of being. That isn't going to serve us in the long run.
I wonder about this often in terms of the purpose of life itself, where if you imagine, it doesn't really matter if you imagine that life began here or it began somewhere else. You have to ask, at least I do, why is it a thing? Why is it an event? Why is it a process that even arises in the universe in the first place? And once it arises, does it have something that it is evolving towards? Because it's hard to think about evolution without there being some kind of
Teleology?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to avoid using the word teleology, but I think that's
goal.
Yeah, exactly. There's got to be some kind of, or there. I want to change how I say that. I don't think that there has to be a goal. I think that there will be a place. Say it again.
We can work with that word. I wouldn't be embarrassed if we can naturalize teleology.
Well, I think that it's different from, like, if you imagine that life begins and then it evolves and it starts with bacteria, like those bacteria don't have a goal yet, right? So it's hard to say that life itself has a goal, but I think that you can say that it has a point that it will inevitably arrive at by virtue of having evolved towards it.
Why do the bacteria not have a goal? I don't understand.
They don't have a goal that is...
It might just be to get to the other side of the rock or something. But...
Exactly, but it's not a goal... Sorry, say that again.
They might just want to get to the other side of the rock where the metals are that they're breathing or whatever it is.
Exactly, but they don't have a goal of like... Because the place that I'm trying to get to...
Of like becoming an Anastasia? Is that what you're saying?
Not becoming an Anastasia, specifically becoming a creature that then leaves the planet and continues the chain of life elsewhere. And so I'm like, it's hard for me to say that life begins with that goal in mind, because that requires some kind of like larger mental structure that's already got the entire sense of omnipotent time in mind, where it's like kind of like mushing things around.
Did you just make the leap that the goal is to leave the planet? I'm
saying that there's a place that life will inevitably arrive at, which is the fracture point of, do you die with your planet or do you leave the planet and continue somewhere else in some recognizable form? And so that's why I'm just like stumbling over myself to make the case that it's not a goal, it's an inevitability of being alive on a planet in a universe where physical objects also evolve towards either being part of a stable, harmonious solar system or being flung out into interstellar space where everything gets covered by snow and ice and slowly dies. Right? So it's life has to make that decision. And as you're talking about the different paths that it can follow once it gets to the level of humans and the other animals that are shaping in macroscopic ways the consumption and use of resources. It's like, is it possible for a naturalistic culture to ever seek to leave the earth, or is it one that inevitably has to die with the earth?
Yeah. So the to bring it to make sure everyone's coming along, teleology here. Aristotle had this idea of multiple different causes of ways of explaining why stuff happens. That's kind of what a cause is really like, this is why this happened. And one of those causes was teleological cause, or goal-directedness. So, certain things have their function by virtue of that they seem to be striving towards some goal. And life is really emblematic of this, in that I would say, what life is I would say it's possible in our universe, it seems, for collections of matter to do this dance of self-persistence that we call life, to kind of keep themselves going. And by a kind of Darwinian logic that, survival of the fittest, whatever's good at surviving will survive, basically, which may seem like a tautology, that like things that are good at persisting will persist, but it's incredibly powerful as a logic, because what it kind of says is, if it's possible for that to happen, even if it's incredibly rare, if it happens once, it's a good bet that will just keep going, and we'll see it around us. And that's kind of what we see with life. So once something starts doing that dance, you can say that's a goal-directed system, because in its very organization, it contains the logic of its own self-persistence. It's like a tornado, or like a vortex where the causality is persistence. So that's what I meant when I said that I think living things are evolutionary processes. The process of evolution is not goal-directed, as you point out, in a sense where there's a God's eye view and a kind of, well, I'm over here and I want to get over there, and now we're going to get, but kind of instant by instant, this kind of force or imperative. It's not an extra force we have to add to physics, but it's a kind of, we can actually get into that there's this emerging paradigm, kind of Bayesian mechanics, where you could say we can extend physics to say that actually these thermodynamic, self-perpetuating dynamics really are a kind of an extra layer of what's going on in our physical world. But so there, it makes sense to say that I have a goal now to communicate words to the audience, and that's why these words are coming out of my mouth. If you refuse to speak thinking those terms, you will actually be confused about biology. It's built in. The not wanting to die is the fundamental goal. Things that kind of don't care about whether or not they die, they don't live very, very long. So the things that get selected for don't want to die, basically. Now,
can I add something to that equation as well, or at least try something on with you and see if it sits with you? I see there being this other force at play, which is creative as well, which I think it goes beyond surviving. Like, I heard this really funny Dylan quote this morning, written down somewhere, where Dylan said something to the effect of, I don't think life is anything about discovering yourself or finding yourself or anything like that. It's about creating yourself. And I thought that was actually not only deeply profound, but also related to what we're talking about here in terms of what life does, that I see as being extremely unique in the universe.
Yeah.
Which is that it has this ability, and maybe even on evolutionary timescales, Anastasia would probably have something to say about that. But maybe even on these timescales, life is directing itself towards this unimagined or yet unimagined version of itself along the way. Like, there's something deeply imaginative and projecting into the future about what's going on with life.
Like, I think that this is where lineages come from, where the foundation is what you said, that the things that don't have a goal of surviving don't make it very long. And then if you imagined life emerging and then there being absolutely no differentiation between preferences, where each organism that emerges just has a random set of preferences, then I don't think that you can ever actually get a diffusion of forms or an evolution of kinds, because evolution of kind of requires you to have a preference.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's so much there I'd love to pick up on. So the thing of the Dylan quote is great, because I mentioned this kind of Bayesian mechanics. The work that's at the core of this is the work of Carl Friston and his free energy principle, which is this kind of began as a theory of brain function, but kind of has become this much grander thing. And one way to describe the core way that relates to life is this phenomenon called self-evidencing, which is basically to say that things that persist in the way we're talking about, they do so by having, you could say, that by having, as you mentioned, preferences or expectations, predictions about what kind of feedback they're going to get from the world. And then that's basically, by confirming those predictions, that's the only way to be like as a living thing. So to make that more concrete, a fish is basically, you could describe a fish as something where it's constantly expecting to be in water, just in the way its physiology operates, not in some cognitive way. And so if you take it out of the water, there'll be all these alarm signals going off like to try to get it back to the water. But so kind of mathematically, the way people describe this is, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. By conducting oneself in a way that I'm the kind of thing that's in water, you become the kind of thing that's in water, because that dance, that self-referential dance, is what it is to be alive, really, which I find quite trippy. But yeah, so these dynamics are, I'm kind of saying that from that, as well as being coupled to the water, you need sensation, but you also need these beliefs about what's going on in the world. So this is this whole thing of seeing living things as things that are discovering how to be in the world, and to do that, you need to be connected to the world, aware of what's going on in the world, basically.
And one of the best ways to connect yourself to the world is by creating the world. Like, that's a really profound experience that life forms have, is I can make this day unfold within some limits, right? You know, there's some like tactical sense in which I'm talking that's very immediate, but we have the ability as organisms to build what's around us, essentially, in our relationships, our physical environments. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah.
So I actually think that, to connect this to what you were saying about the self-evidencing, and that the fish has a set of programs that basically tell it that I have to be in water, I think that at least some of evolution has to be driven by how flexible those parameters are. And so an individual that's able to push against the boundaries of what is expected for its kind is likely going to be the one that's able to progress into some direction that leads it to something else. And so the way that I see humans is that they are creatures that have maximized agency at each step of the way. And so what Shiloh is talking about, which is this ability to mold the world as you see it, seems to be at least part and parcel of the thing that humans have driven themselves towards. Like, that's the product of all of our technological progress, is to be able to say that nature made me like this, and yet I will fly, and yet I will Zoom with someone in Portugal, and yet I will have fire, and all of these other things.
Yeah, so you're both pointing to this phenomenon of like niche construction would be the kind of maybe technical word for like the way that organisms create. They change the environment in which they're in, which creates new niches for new things to evolve. And so to bring this back to the teleology thing of like, you know, beyond just every local living thing, like me having my goals, people have spoken about this idea that there is some grand goal. It's all heading somewhere. And my preference for the circular, I think, makes me feel like this moment is it. Like we're always in an evolving present moment. We're not going to get to some final conclusion. Yet at the same time, there is because of that kind of niche construction thing, there is like this process of complexification is another way of describing it. It seems to be ongoing, and just kind of things get more and more complex. And there's an amazing book by a guy called Bobby Azarian, who you guys should probably have on. He'd be fun to chat to. He wrote a book called The Romance of Reality that deals with pretty much a lot of the same science that I'm pointing to. And he has a kind of, I guess it's complementary to my book, because he really, his whole message is one of, you could say, cosmic teleology in a kind of naturalized way, where it's like he thinks that there's not going to be a heat death of the universe. We're not moving towards maximum entropy. We're moving towards kind of maximum saturation of order, that we are going to get off planet and everything's going to get into some a mega point saturation of complexity. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. I still kind of work within the heat death paradigm. But I do think on the other side of that, there'll probably be something. But yeah, so there are people thinking through this new emerging picture of teleology and the core role of life in it, who do think that there is some where it's going, but it's not going to a predetermined destination. The getting off planet thing is an interesting example, because you explicitly tied it to the certainty of our extinction if we stay on planet. So it ties it back to the Darwinian logic. And so you could say the amoeba has no idea that space even exists, and so it obviously doesn't know, and evolution doesn't know that's where it's going. On the other hand, it's kind of guaranteed that once you get to creatures like us, they're going to try and make that move, probably, because, or like, if it's possible, the ones that survive will be the ones that succeeded to do that. So it is kind of built in some sense, this like expansion.
And so that leads us very neatly to the question that I think often comes up when you talk to people that don't spend a lot of time thinking about consciousness, which is like, why does the way that we think about consciousness matter for any of this? Like, does it change the outcome of being able to make it off Earth? Does it have this direct implication?
We've been kicking the can of the hard problem down the road, haven't we? Really, this. So we say that with that.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah. So just since you mentioned coming back to consciousness, yeah. So I can kind of address it now, because it really is you could say this issue of how the quantitative physical world relates to this qualitative inner world in a kind of broad sense, or the way I think it's unconsciously articulated is this gap between presuming brains and consciousness. So when you say like, understanding consciousness, I do think really that's the project is understanding where it fits into our story of existence, and that gap is the current gap that kind of is where you need to be acting if you want to close that story. So consciousness is funny because it's like, from how we show up in the world, it's like the first thing that's here. Like we begin with opening our eyes and taking in the world. Then we do science. Then we do philosophy. Then we just talk to other people, explore the world, have sensory experiences. And so in that sense, consciousness kind of comes first, and then we discover kind of where we are in the world. But then obviously it makes sense to try and say, well, that doesn't give you an answer of like where it comes into existence. So then you need to do the science. And if you can close that gap, then you get into, I think this fundamental issue of like, who are we? What are we? Where are we in existence? And that to me is the foundation from which to make any sensible moves. If you're talking about as a society, as individuals, if we're fundamentally confused about who and what and where we are in existence, I think we're going to make probably bad decisions, or just we're necessarily going to make kind of ignorant decisions, I guess.
So it seems almost like it offers a moral lens, the study of consciousness.
That's really interesting, yeah, because someone was saying to me before, they think that my book kind of, I guess, is pointing in that direction. In like ancient philosophy, they were saying that they have like philosophers wouldn't just deal with nature of reality or the mind. They would also typically weigh in on ethics as well. Kind of what should we do now that we're here? And I do feel like when I described at the beginning that desire for harmony, that love of harmony, I do feel that's kind of what motivates me. So I feel like the stuff we spoke about like, what should we do in this moment here and now? How should we orient? What's like, and the answer for me for that is really one of kind of, you could say, I think the thing that leads to disharmony and suffering is a sense of separation, a sense of I'm focusing on myself and pushing the world away. I'm other than nature. I'm other than this universe. I'm alienated, under threat, fearful. I think that the psychology of separation is at the root of discord, whereas an experience of connection and openness kind of leads to homeostatic balancing, harmonization. And so I think, given that society is made up of human beings, I do think there's this kind of inside-out way of looking at changing our situation for ethically for the better, which is individuals orienting towards openness in the present moment. We're basically talking about mindfulness, I think mindfulness is maybe the core trait here, but just inner work that leads towards greater individual, reducing that sense of separation between yourself and the rest of the world. And I think that's the root issue that would lead to a greater outcome ethically. Even though maybe, usually when we talk about ethics, it's like, well, in this problem, what would you do? And in that problem, I'm saying it's almost like the software, the operating system has this bug of like selfish ego, me, self-concern, separation, fear. And if we can update that operating system, it almost doesn't matter what ethical question you then bring forward. you're dealing at a kind of meta level of like, what's the real neurosis here? What's the real issue?
I love that.
It's funny. I think that a lot of these issues we're discussing today were not as important to individuals living in highly religious societies. I could be completely wrong, but I think I'm going to put that hypothesis on the table because I feel like formerly, okay, maybe I should just say what I know. I know that religion in the West has never been less popular than it is today. I also know that religious people tend to be healthier and happier than non-religious people. And I also know that religion has brought a tremendous amount of suffering on the universe as well. So it's a very complicated phenomenon. But there's something about religion that organizes people under the banner of some ethics, aesthetics, and approach to the cosmos in general. And we can include the ecological landscape, right? There's metaphors and mythologies that go along with that plan. And I feel like there's something interesting in the last 100 years or so, maybe even the last 50 years, maybe increasingly so, where we expect science and rationality to do the jobs that we would have pawned off on some mythological institutions formerly. And now we're trying really hard to fit them into the wheelhouse of science, technology, philosophy, these rational arts that don't depend on what we would hope would be, they don't depend on sort of arbitrary authority structures like priests or churches that will intercede from our own understanding of our relationship to the cosmos. But I'm also not sure that we're totally equipped to deal with them, or maybe these are the growing pains of working that out. You know, maybe that's what this revolution in consciousness studies is all about, is trying to find a place for this in rational discourse.
Yeah. So the when I said that, I think the root of these issues is the kind of the mistaken belief of separation or the illusion of separation. Kind of what I'm pointing to there is that I do think reality is fundamentally unitive, whole, one, you could say. When people have experiences of oneness, I think that's a genuine insight. It's a genuine recognition of, reality being like an ocean in which we're waves rather than the mind that makes us think that we're truly separate. So that sense of wholeness, that's where we get the word holy from. I think that's at the root of religion, is this recognition, this personal experience one can have in gradations and sometimes in kind of mind-breaking cataclysmic revelations of this fact that we're not separate, we're not alienated. And this can show up in, Buddhism teaching that there is no separate self that actually exists. This could show up in Jesus talking about love. Across world traditions, I think they're pointing in a similar direction. And I think what happens is there's with certain spiritual teachers, there's like a revelation and people, there's a freshness to this. Like, again, we spoke before about the love of wisdom, the love of harmony, but then over time, the basic human neurosis of ego kind of sees that everyone likes that, everyone wants to be near that nourishment of that wholeness, and then they can realize, oh, the charlatans can come in and get power here. And then you get hierarchical religions and the priest saying, well, don't worry, I'll gatekeep now. You can give me the power and I'll, keep God hidden in some transcendent elsewhere. So I unpack this in the book in terms of transcendent religions versus kind of immanent spiritualities, a sense that you could say like a pantheism, that the word God, if it means anything, like Einstein and Spinoza argued for this, like God is the totality of existence. God, if that word means anything, it's just the universe, and you're fully part of that. So you have access to that as much as the priest does, So I think it's funny that like I was raised Catholic and really rejected the dogma of it very aggressively. And so I thought for a long time, if I knew anything, it was that kind of organized religion is bad. And now I guess I now feel like the kind of the white hot beating heart of it, of this revelation of wholeness is necessary. It's what points us towards sanity and towards harmony and ethics. And I don't think there's actually any getting around it. But I still have in my system I don't like that this loop seems inevitable in the way that like it becomes corrupted and so what I'm excited about is the fact that I think we're at a stage now where we can marry it with science, which is probably what I'm trying to do. So you get it out of charismatic gurus and abusive leaders and stuff like that onto paper and say like, here's my working, here's my philosophical claims, let's all interrogate them, have them open to criticism. But there's nothing supernatural to me or weird about the idea of reality being whole. the word whole doesn't mean anything supernatural, So
And it encodes such a practical wisdom at the end of the day, too, which is something like if you take care of people or you take care of your landscape, it will take care of you. Like there's this reciprocity with existence, right? And I think that's what you're getting at with this wholeness. And it is not irrational. It is, you can be as selfish as you want about it. Hey, if you want to succeed as a life form in this universe, like you need to cooperate with your surroundings, essentially, including other organisms. Like that is the way forward, no matter how pathological you want to look at it, or, you still will arrive at the same cold, rational conclusion that that's what's going to work out in the long run, right? You can betray, you can betray your environment, betray your friends, maybe once, and maybe they'll forgive you, but how long can you keep doing that for? Right?
Yeah. No, I think people who want to reject this stuff on a gut level can either collapse from like, oh, this is woo-woo, whatever nonsense, through to, well, actually, it's so obvious that it's trivial, you don't even need to say it, like in the way that you're saying there, that like...
I don't think it doesn't need to be said, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So I think we're talking actually about something quite simple here, but its simplicity belies its kind of, I guess it being like a linchpin from which you can get everything else in terms of, without this guiding principle of moving towards, or at least orienting towards wholeness, which involves openness psychologically, because if you're closed off and pinned down and you're not going to be open to that. I think that's the dial we all have access to, and that we can, again, like the middle way thing, we don't have to all just suddenly collapse into deep radical openness, but we can just start tilting that dial, a bit more internal awareness, a bit more connection, a bit more love in the world. And like Aldous Huxley had this great quote where he was like something like, it's rather embarrassing that after a lifetime of dealing with the issues of like the plague humanity, the best conclusion I can come to is that we all try and be a little nicer to each other, or a little kinder to each other, I think it was. But there's something like, it's like, like you can really grapple with this, but that is the meta, that's that connection. That's that, like, we need to just open up and harmonize. And
I think the word connection is critical. Like, I like to say that I have an interconnected cosmology that I embrace, like from every scale, from the atomic all the way to the interpersonal, because I think that people have a hard time relinquishing themselves to the wholeness. But if you talk about everything as being enchained to everything else through some series of relays or whatever it is, it becomes very easy for people to preserve their sense of self, but realize that they're not acting in isolation in the universe either. And they can either work against the universe or work with the universe. And obviously, it's much more productive to do the latter.
Yeah. Well, so that cosmology as well is I absolutely embrace, and the you could say that the core kind of metaphysical thing I put into the mix that I think means you don't need the hard problem of consciousness is that interconnection. And the way that I say it is that reality is inherently relational. It is an interdependent whole. It's the whole relating to itself. So really only connections exist. And this is a bit kind of trippy to people that like you have the one interacting with itself, but there aren't actually separate things doing the interacting. And our minds really like to solidify and think of things as being solid, separate, tangible objects. But this is, this has been unpacked in Carlo Rovelli's book, Helgoland. He's a kind of leading physicist, and he argues this relational vision of quantum mechanics where only the interactions exist. And this fits, a few years ago, some physicists won the Nobel Prize for providing evidence that our universe is not locally real. When you interact with a particle before that interaction, there isn't actually an existing thing there. So what I'm saying is happening in that moment, and what people like Rovelli are saying, is we are part of the energy of existence. We are the universe interacting with itself. There is that interface, but really it's like interfaces all the way down. It's just the universe interfacing with itself without solid separate objects anywhere. And when you embrace that view, you see consciousness too as an interface, as the interface organisms use. So really everything is relationship, everything is connection. And in that view, you don't need a gap between matter and mind.
I would modify that slightly to say that I'm deeply uncomfortable with making the whole of the universe abstraction. Like, I think that I laughed when I was reading the introduction to your book because you said that, the naive physicalist would say that the only thing that exists is matter. And I was like, I'm going to have a hard time with a book that calls me naive right out of the gate.
I mean, then a philosophical definition rather than as an insult.
I got that as I read farther, but I think that it makes much more sense to me to think that the only thing that exists is matter. And you can debate like what is the fundamental structure of matter, and then the only thing that matters is relation. Because matter without any context, without any interactions, I always use the thought experiment of like a single atom universe. A single atom universe goes nowhere, does nothing, has no time, has no space, has no distance, has no motion. But as soon as you start to have even two, now there's the ability to communicate and exchange and remain not at equilibrium. And so I agree completely that the only thing that seems like it exists is relation. And the philosophical frame that I would use for it is that matter exists and relation is the only thing that matters.
Matter exists, relationships occur.
Yeah.
It really depends on how you define existence, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, this does all come down to definitions because I would very comfortably call myself a physicalist in terms of these words. Or I have a bit in the book where I basically say I could tell this story from wearing different hats, as an idealist, as a physicalist, as a panpsychist, which makes me feel like I'm onto something. If the maps suddenly start to look like maps, that the territories beyond the maps. But the caveat is, I guess I would say, whatever the patterns in reality are that physicists study, that those patterns, whatever that is, that's what I call the physical, and I think that's pretty reasonable. That shouldn't be very controversial. I think that's what we all do.
I would call those dynamics.
Right, exactly. So I think that's the what I don't think exists though is substance. So this could feel, substance is the idea that we have some solid ground is very psychologically reassuring. It's it's arguably the core, well, I would say psychologically what on an embodied emotional level, we want stability, we want control, we want order. And in our phenomenology, the way that shows up is the impression of solidity and substance, something where if something's insubstantial, there's nothing really there, right? It doesn't have any weight to it. There's no, so whereas something with substance is like reliable, dependable, you can lean on it, you can interact with it, it offers some control. So I think substance is this kind of psychological desire we have for there to be some solid ground. And I think philosophically and scientifically, when we investigate that, the ground seems to disappear. This idea that particles don't exist before you measure them is the mainstream position. It's not a fringe position. It's the kind of the idea of reality not being locally real is not some wacky, it's Nobel Prize winning stuff. But it's an invitation. It's kind
of strange that you can only make that assertion with some extremely intense measuring devices. Whereas if I just go for a walk, like I'm definitely sure the ground is solid and it's going to matter, or like the bus is going to be solid if I step out in front of it, right? So reality is extremely locally real as far as I can tell. And I don't have super colliders or anything like that, but I have a strong feeling that that's an interpretation of a measurement that's gone completely sideways.
And this is also an established academic position as well, which is that it is certainly far less popular than the kind of the quantum world is so weird and insubstantial. And I think that this is a metaphysical fracture that we often encounter with people that are studying consciousness, which is that we're like, I think you can have all of this without removing the idea that there is physical substrate. And we talk about it so often on the show. And what it really comes down to is that there is a very popular school in the world that says that it isn't there. And if you build your assumptions by assuming that that school is correct, you come up with an insubstantial universe. If you look at those assumptions and you're like, well, with a few different tweaks to the way that we interpret these measurements, we can actually come up with something that's different and hasn't won Nobel Prizes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's incorrect. Like, we could go into the entire sociology of Nobel Prizes in science and people's love of superstitious constructions and the need to be able to create these complex universes that are beyond comprehension. And so it's like, we've done it so often that I don't know if it's necessary to
Yeah, we don't have to go completely into weeds, but we can shortcut and say that we can take any equation of quantum mechanics and give it a physical solution. That is possible. Like, we could do that, and we've spent a lot of time doing that, and we have a whole channel devoted to that. But the point is that you can still have a cosmos which is deeply relational and still has a physical substrate to it. That's something that I absolutely embrace. Like I just got done teaching this course at the university, and the last lecture that I did was kind of built around this concept that we have two eyes for a reason, right? So we get depth perception by having two eyes, but more allegorically, when we talk about cosmology, for some reason we've handed cosmologists over to the physicists, right? Which is a very disastrous thing to do, I think, because we have two eyes for a reason. One eye is to make sense of the physical landscape. It's a very physicalist approach to reality. It matters to me if I try to drive a car or something like that. But there's also this relational side, this I shudder to call it a spiritual side, but by spirit, I just mean conceptually abstract, relational in terms of my community and who I am as a being. And both of these pieces are important in constructing a view of reality, because if you just treat everybody like they're atoms, you're not going to have any friends and you're not going to get anywhere. But if you walk around without recognizing that atoms are a thing and you need to cooperate with them and treat them as if they're very real, then you'll end up getting hit by a bus. So there's, again, a real harmony that's necessary between the physicalist and the spiritualist approaches to reality that I think neither one can be completely left behind with a straight face without pointing to like particle detectors or something that don't really matter to us.
To extend the metaphor of the two eyes, one is enough to see the world, but the second is necessary to see depth and relation.
Yeah, so I think, I feel like this is the first time I feel like I've been on many conversations where I'm arguing against idealists about this kind of wacky quantum stuff. It's the first time where I feel like I'm the one who's positioned, like, I always saw myself as a very run-of-the-mill physicalist in terms of not believing anything wacky about this stuff. But I think, when I delved into the what do we mean by physical, like I did come to this conclusion that if we mean substance, I can't square that. It feels kind of supernatural to me, the idea that there would be this free floating ground that exists for some reason, that just kind of like, why does matter kind of come into existence? A kind of a cosmology that, you do see in kind of multiple traditions, whether it's kind of, Buddhism and stuff pointing to an ultimate emptiness or ground or voidness, I actually think is more naturalistic, more, I tell a story in the book about how with that view, you really can get something from nothing, and you could build up this relational picture of the world without needing anything magical, anything supernatural. But
you interact with substance, right? Like,
so the example you gave is interesting, right? When you don't want to be hit by the bus, what I would say is happening there is another relational dynamic where you're right that something will happen if that collection of interactions interacts with you. And then your mind kind of has this representation of it as solidity means something, in that it kind of symbolizes that relationship. But in the same way that, this chair is mainly empty space and I'm mainly empty space, but I don't pass through it, the solidity is that symbolizing that relationship of not passing through it. It doesn't actually mean there's anything called matter that it kind of exists in its own right. So I agree, this is probably...
Well, matter is a concept. Like, I understand that it's a concept, like that we've made that concept, but it's a very practical one, right?
Oh, definitely.
We've defined, look, physical bodies can they're concepts still, for sure. Physical bodies, like, the separation is conceptual, but it's important and practical, right? You can separate out physical bodies from other abstractions in that they do seem to have specific characteristics that have an impact on our future. Like, they have form where you can't be in the same place as that form, right? Or else tragedies ensue in the case of the bus, right? So it's like, it's a practical way of constraining our conceptualization. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, we're still just conceptualizing it.
And I think that, I would be comfortable with describing my position as physicalism to the point where I'm saying consciousness is only a physical dynamic. a holistic dynamic between organism and environment. There isn't an extra magical ingredient called consciousness. Consciousness is as insubstantial as matter, in my opinion. So maybe I'll just so people don't, kind of get why I think this. If you start here, we're in speculative metaphysics, so this is just a story. You can throw this away if it doesn't resonate, but because we're never going to prove it. But if you start with the question of how do you get something from nothing, imagine if nothing existed. What would be the nature of that nothing? Well, it couldn't have boundaries or limits, or because that would be a thing. So it has to be an absence of that, a kind of non-finiteness. That isn't a positive quality; it's kind of negatively defined quality. It doesn't have finite bounds. So you could say that that's synonymous with kind of infinite. It's just expansive, and we know that in an infinite space, anything that can happen will happen. So it's synonymous with potency as well. So I think another way of saying this is, so it's kind of generative. You could say nothing existing is kind of an impossibility. It necessarily evokes something happening because it's synonymous with a kind of unbounded generative quality. So I think,
well, I guess it begs the question: what do you mean happening? Because it seems to me like the least abstract happening is one object moving with respect to another object. Like that is the least abstract happening that I can possibly imagine.
I would boil it down even more to maybe that you could describe it as a polarized flux, where you could say, so like you have these things of like there's a zero energy universe hypothesis where all the positive energy in the universe is cancelled out by all the negative energy. And that's a way of saying how in a kind of fluctuations in a quantum vacuum, you can get from nothing, you can get particles kind of popping into existence because they're defined against their opposite. So in this way, nothing can polarize into two opposites without there needing to be an injection of some extra something. This is again a kind of, not a kind of, these things are debated, but this isn't like a fringe thing. And so I'm generalizing that at a more metaphysical level to say that it makes sense to me that what we call matter could be a happening where there's a kind of relational event kind of defined against its negative event. And then that's why I think our reality is relational, that it's fundamentally empty of any inherent oomph to it. Like there's no injection of substance, but there is this dance of kind of like a house of cards interdependently cashed out against each other. And I think that makes sense of physics. And I think that makes sense of, from there, I think everything kind of hangs together in a naturalistic way. But I think, again, to me, the injection of substance is a kind of supernatural. You may as well say there's a creator God who created the world in 7 days if you're just going to put something on the table without justifying it.
Well, I think that if you have flux, you must have substance, because flux is a concept that is motion of something through a cross-sectional area. And so I hear what you're saying about, okay, well, if you have positive flux and you have negative flux and they cancel to create the appearance of nothing, you can have a breakdown of that equilibrium condition where all of the sudden there is more of the positive flux or more of the negative flux, which then creates an imbalance, which instead of your detector reading 0, now it reads 1. Is that kind of the vision?
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of balanced imbalance, I guess, like a flux.
So I think, hold on, I know. This is like, how do I explain this? The same way that we came across the hard problem of consciousness and we're like, this doesn't actually make sense as a problem. We tend to view lots of other things in the same way, and this thing about the interpretation of quantum as signifying a fundamental insubstantiality of the world, I think is a similar issue to the way that the hard problem of consciousness has been overlaid on something where if you just shift the perspective a tiny bit, your metaphysics change to such a degree that everything at the higher level is still correct in the sense that you're like looking down through the layers of relations and you're coming to the correct conclusion. And the only real shift is this question of infinity and eternity and nothingness and somethingness, which gives you the same outcome in a sense, because you can build stuff on top of it in a way that's mutually consistent and correct. And what we've stumbled into a conversation that we have a lot, and I really believe that there's a different interpretation of quantum mechanics that leads you to a substantial world that radically changes the universe that we live in without necessarily changing the outcome of any of the thoughts that we have about consciousness or relations or how all of this works.
Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, that kind of project was my strong bias, to want that to be the kind of solution. And so I only say what I'm saying now out of a sincere desire to communicate how I see the pieces fitting together as best I can. And when I first came across this, it was kind of confronting, really, because on a personal level, I want to present myself, the serious scientist side of myself, as forwardly as possible, and not to be dismissed as woo or like anything like that. But it's where the thinking led me. But also the thing about the bus and the experience of solidity, when one gets deep into kind of, I guess, like you could say meditative practice or different kind of practice like that, your phenomenology can change where emptiness becomes very intuitive, very kind of apparent in experience. Emptiness is the Buddhist term for what we're talking about here. That the flip side of emptiness is interdependence, where it's like the more you reach for the essence of something, the more you realize that essence is imputed by your mind. It isn't actually there to be found. So like think of like in ancient Greece, this philosophical thought experiment of the ship of Theseus. This guy called Theseus has a ship. Over time, he replaces all the boards and it all gets swapped out. And is that still the same ship? And it kind of points this intuition we have that there's some kind of, there's something that actually exists there that is the ship of Theseusness. I can't really say that. Should choose a different example. The appleness of an apple, so let's say. And it turns out that these phenomena hang together, but there is no nucleus of an identity there. That's something that our object perception imputes onto things. So my conclusion is that I think we do that with particles. It's kind of, at our scale, it makes sense that things are made of solid building blocks. Castles can be made of Lego bricks. Sand castles can be made of sand. And I think the idea of an atomic, as in particle universe, is reassuring in that sense. But I think it's it's an evolved primate way of seeing the world that we shouldn't think should generalize to the very fabric of reality. Is my kind of.
Hey folks, pardon the interruption. I need to ask you for a serious favor, which is if you enjoy this program, we need your help to keep it going. And the way you can support us is by making the tiniest donation possible over at patreon.com/DemystifySci. And you will power this program into more and more of what you love to hear. So I'll see you there at patreon.com/DemystifySci.
Shiloh and I really were laughing about this last night, where I feel like people will wander into this quantum conversation with us, and I feel like we've invited them to our house, and then it turns out that our house is basically, there was a horror movie a while ago called Saw, where people would have to like solve puzzles, and then there's the serial killer, and I'm like, we're the Saw guy in this story. Innocent people wander into our lair, and we're like, well, what exists? And so, so I'm terribly sorry for, like, we can't help ourselves, because I do think that people who listen to this show have been with us for like 300 or more episodes. Like these are the metaphysics that we put pretty clearly on the table, that like you have to have a world of stuff that exists. And I think that you can take quantum mechanics apart and interpret it in a way as telling you a story about a world that does in fact exist. And I ultimately think that it doesn't matter if you're operating on one step above the literal foundation of the universe. Like the question of, is it an infinite universe? Did it begin? Are atoms made of a substance that then allows them to communicate electromagnetic radiation between them and mediate gravity? Or is it all just like fields in flux? I'm like, I don't think that it bears on most questions. I think that almost all conventional physicists will tell you that the Nobel Prize winning interpretations of quantum mechanics are the correct ones. And I think that people that are working really hard on a question that already makes them a little bit of a heretic are entitled to exactly one crazy idea. Like, I think that that's just the nature of the way that we encounter things in this academic context, where as soon as you're like, well, I think you're wrong about consciousness, and I think you're wrong about quantum mechanics, and I think you're wrong about plate tectonics, and I think you're wrong about how the sun works, it's like, who are you? Like, you're not somebody we're going to listen to.
Demystify Sci.
Yeah, exactly.
We have not won any Nobel Prizes.
And so maybe the best thing to say is like, to say that these are two metaphysical worldviews. And I've always wondered, I'm like, if a Christian and a Buddhist show up, I don't think that debating whether the universe began when God moved over the waters or was born from, I actually don't know the Buddhist cosmology well enough to say, I think it's an infinite universe.
I
But
don't
like,
know either, yeah.
I think that if you start debating the details of those metaphysics, it's just less interesting than the next level up, which is the question of consciousness and what the study of it allows us to do and the role that it plays. What do you think?
Yeah, I just want to be like 100% clear for our audience and for you. Like, we're not advocating some strict physicalism in that we think that the physical universe is all that matters or anything crazy like that. Like, we're very much harmonically balanced between there is a physical universe of substance, there's a universe of relationships, and I don't think that there's supremacy of the physical substance or anything like that. I mean, I think that bus will give you a bad day or something, but I wouldn't treat my life as just a series of physical transactions either at the same time. So
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't have to we could have an entire podcast if we wanted to tear that apart. But
Yeah.
maybe
I mean, I think I would
we
be
can drift on.
I could, call myself a non-reductive physicalist as well, in the sense I was saying before that, as you mentioned, Shiloh, that physical is a word we use for certain, it's a concept, in a sense, but I'm not a materialist, you could say, in that there's some material substance. But the reason I'm, I initially was going to write the book without going into this stuff, and to just, because I think there's a good case to be made from, as you said, that like, you can talk about the physical dynamics and how, it makes sense that life is where consciousness exists. You can tell that story. I feel like this extra piece, though, does a lot of, I think what it allows you to do is treat the hard-nosed physicalist scientists and the kind of rigorous contemplatives with equal respect. So when I say rigorous contemplatives, what I mean is you have some spiritual people who sometimes will be idealists because they'll say stuff like, okay, we mentioned at the start that awareness is this kind of, it's common to all experience. It seems to be some open, receptive, formless space in which experiences arise. If someone were to say, like, how do you get that open formlessness from physical forms? Like, that seems weird, doesn't it? I think they're kind of onto something. And this is kind of why it's relevant, that I think that when a mystic, a contemplative, has the intuition that consciousness is grounded in some very deep way, I think that's not a complete misperception. I don't think consciousness is the foundation of existence, but I do think the kind of the metaphysical principle of some potent openness to me is like, I think if one can get on board with that as a possibility, I do think that there's a sense in which our experience partakes in that formless, potent openness, but to actually have content, to actually be actual, it needs to be embodied through the physical, through an organism relating to the rest of the universe. So, and even there, I would say the aware quality, the knowingness, still requires a physical instantiation to relate. I don't think bare potency, why would it be aware of anything? Like, to me, you need some very simple bare mechanism of relating for there to be awareness. So to me, I think this is a nice way of synthesizing those two camps and being like, look, both of you have really good points, and both of you, the scientists really make a good point about how, in us at least, consciousness does relate to the brain, even though I think that's because it's part of the living body. And then I think the contemplatives have a point that, like, consciousness isn't like other physical, simple physical phenomena where they're clearly just forms. There's something a bit seemingly non-physical about it, but so this is a way that I think you can tell a naturalistic picture that does justice to both, but it does require you to let go of the solid ground, and that becomes a kind of a personal project of, like, because it's very, the saw analogy is apt. It is an invitation to kind of really reckon with the absolute basis from which we move forward in the world, which is the sense there is some solid ground here. And so an invitation into groundlessness is a very personal, it's an invitation, to see what the contemplatives are up to, basically. But not everyone, understandably wants to go on that journey.
Well, I think that it's a really important journey against the backdrop of atheistic, purely physicalist materialism. Because I've been playing with this idea recently, and I want to know what you think about it, which is that it seems like every society up until maybe whatever you want to say emerged in the Enlightenment was one that had both a spiritual commitment as well as a relationship to the physical world, where they, from ancient Egypt to the Vedics to the Confucians to the Incas, everybody,
The Constitution of the United States.
yeah, like every single society that functions well seems to have an ability to deal with the material reality of astronomical clocks and agriculture and the domestication of animals and all of the political rules and strictures that allow you to develop a functional world. And then they also have this deep spiritual practice, the legends and stories and myths that they tell about the supernatural principles that organize the world. Like even if
Relational. They don't have to be supernatural.
that's exactly where I was going to go, right?
Right.
Because even if you look at Confucianism, which is a system that is inherently non-supernatural, they still have the principle of, I think it's called Tian, which is that there are overarching relations that govern a harmonious and balanced world. And so what I feel like the study of consciousness does, what it is doing, is it is kind of modulating this materialistic view that took over for so long, which is that no, there is no soul, there is no vital force, there's no animating principle that gives you a sense of what is good and what you should move towards and what the nature of the universe really is. Because it's like, well, how do you get that out of raw atoms? And now it's coming into the scientific fold because people are realizing that, like, well, we've been doing whatever you want to call civilization for like 15,000 years, right? Like Göbekli Tepe is clearly the sign of a culture that has some sort of abstract relationship to the cosmos and is also agricultural and is also developed. So it's like, okay.
Göbekli Tepe wasn't agricultural, was it?
Agriculture developed on the Huron Plain right next door to Göbekli Tepe within like a very, very short period of time. So at the very least, they're associated with the evolution of these agricultural technologies. And I think that they did have domestication of animals by this point.
They certainly have some sort of relational respect for animals because a lot of the carvings are animistic in nature. I mean, look, 100%. People have had that basis for reality.
And so just what I'm saying is that like we tried to erase that in our modern culture, where we tried to scrape it all away down to some bare bones thing of just stuff. And I think that it doesn't work. And so the study of consciousness seems to be this clarion call to say, well, hold on a second, perhaps we can take this materialist worldview and merge it to something that is cosmic and meaningful in a way that doesn't force us to forego our scientific principles and fully embrace something that is maybe like woo or whatever you want to call it, because we need it and we haven't given it to ourselves. And so all of our pain seems to emerge from that cleavage.
Yeah, I would say my foremost commitment is to naturalism, to some sense that our understanding of the world should cohere and be kind of reasonable and philosophically consistent. And that in the book I advocate for what I call non-dual naturalism, because non-duality is this term for this wholeness we spoke about, non-separation, and I think that too is a sense that reality coheres, hangs together, is whole. And I think our maps should also do the same thing. And so if someone posits something with no reason, that's where, I'm not a fan of supernatural explanations, because again, it's that kind of disharmony thing. So to that point, I think there's a great researcher of animism called Graham Harvey, who he's part of a group of scholars who have kind of reinterpreted what animism is. And they argue that the initial description of it as a belief in spirits that live in everything was just a kind of a misunderstanding, a mischaracterization. And really what it is about wise reciprocal relationality with the rest of the world. So, for example, I can't remember which group he was part of, but he was talking to this indigenous person and he said, are all rocks people? And he was like, no, but some are. And so he that led him on this kind of quest, like, what do you mean by that? What makes a rock a person? And again, you can think of this in the sense of like, If a particular rock has significance to you, think of a kid on a beach collecting a pebble. Like, some rocks will have very personal significance. And in a mode where you're radically kind of empathizing with things because you relate to them, and as these social primates that know how to kind of anthropomorphize and imbue things with a sense of subjectivity, I think you could tell a naturalistic picture where like that, like treating a rock as a person, if it's of significance to you, I mean, but more significantly, say a river, right? If you want to treat it well and not have your water be destroyed, this could be a very wise mode of interacting with the world that doesn't have to be seen as supernatural. It doesn't have to be, oh, these are kind of culturally immature primitives, was the kind of racist, stereotyping when this stuff was first described. And rather it could be seen as, so our modern culture has this very fixated idea that we need to understand how everything is like literally, like, is that literally true? Is the rock a person? What is it? Like, pin everything down, like butterflies with killed and put pins through their wings. It's like they want to drain the life out of everything, get it all pinned down and under control. And this is, I think other cultures perhaps live in a more mythopoetic way of relating to the world, where it's like, well, who cares? Like, if like what I mean precisely by that rock's a person, like, do I need to pin it down?
Well, what's crazy is you say other cultures, and I think racism is the right analogy, but it's something in our own line of heredity, which is really strange. Like, we tend to have this prejudice against people that came before us and treating them as if they're sort of superstitious idiots in some sense.
Right.
Like, oh, isn't that cute? They made these Disney tales or whatever, and they, had temples where they talked about them. And I get how you would think that, because I also was raised in a church where I would listen to these fairy tales and be like, are you guys serious? Like, you guys know Santa Claus isn't real, right? But the older I got, the more seriously I took those texts as really genuine, almost Shakespearean level epics of how consequence plays out in the universe, right? And I think that the more that I study the mythopoetic basis of these early civilizations, the less I see them as superstitious primitives, and the more I see them as having developed a sophisticated code for expressing wisdom about how to act out a proper future for yourself and for your civilization in the world. And we lack that uniform approach right now. And so I see what we're trying to do here in some sense with this study of consciousness is perhaps reformulate that understanding of ourselves with respect to the cosmos that is productive in the long run. At least I hope that's what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think, to that point, the, being raised Christian as well, I was taught this very kind of literalist understandings of what those texts meant, that then as a teenager it becomes very easy to dismiss them and say, well, of course there's not a physical place called heaven with a physical man-like being called God who's, well, or maybe not physical, but like, an actual solid being who interacts with people. And so when you read something like in the Bible, say Jesus saying the kingdom of God is within you, to me that hits my ears like, does he mean there's a place with a man in it who's called God? And like, no, like that to me sounds like a kind of a poetic pointing towards perhaps the same things we're talking about, that if you do this inner exploration and you find that's the route to harmony and wholeness, which, kingdom of God seems like a reasonable, especially if you think of God as a term pointing to that wholeness. So suddenly, if you just open the possibility that history isn't full of idiots and is in fact perhaps full of people who are kind of wise and using language in their own way, I think there's a lot of riches to be found there.
Which then paints this modern study of consciousness in a really strange light, because as far as I can tell, this idea of the hard problem, which we have long been meaning to get to, has been at the center of this modern study of consciousness. And I don't really understand how, I mean, you made the historical case, right? That like it has to be this consequence of what it meant to build empires. But it's strange to me that, in the late 1900s, people that are trying to understand consciousness in this sense come down to, well, it must have come from brains and not from something holistic. Like, how does that emerge in the modern day?
Yeah, so I think if you go back to the philosophers who kind of set the stage in the last few hundred years for where we're at now, I think there's also a selection effect where you do have very wise philosophers like Spinoza who argued for what you call neutral monism, which is that reality itself isn't made of matter or mind, but matter and mind are kind of modes within that that reality. And that's kind of, you could say, the kind of stance I take. But at the same time, or shortly before, was Descartes, who argued, for the only humans are conscious. We're conscious by connection by virtue of our connection with God. We were talking about psychopathy earlier, and Descartes actually tortured his wife's dog to kind of show that there's no subjectivity here. Look, when it seems to be yelping in pain, if you do reductionism and you just focus on the parts, then you can't see the pain. All you see is lungs acting like bellows and muscles moving. Like, so I think that there's a connection here when I was talking about the individual's state as someone feeling disconnected and alienated, and in that case, somewhat psychopathic, and this inability to empathize with other living things as subjects when you treat them as objects. And it does come down to the holism, because he was the father of reductionism. The idea that to understand things, you break them down into their parts. So I think when you look at the whole dog and you use your capacity to kind of understand what it is to be a living thing and to see that as a living thing, it's really obvious that it has subjectivity and is in pain. But that way of that story was a very neat story to then justify the plunder of the natural world. So I think there's a selection effect where it's not that everyone saw it the same way. Even peasants, apparently at that time, there's still a lot of paganism and a lot of kind of connection to nature. So it's very much a kind of, you could say, propaganda, like stories being told that suit the people who wanted to conduct themselves in that way. And then today, it kind of, as that culture's kind of gone into overdrive, I think we just have this feedback where it feels like it's, on so many levels, we're just encouraged to not think that way. And then there's a kind of a more reasonable basis, which is that humans are the only creatures that can actually report on their subjective states. So we should be studying the human brain if we want to really study consciousness rigorously. But then the extra piece to say, well, this creature is conscious, the human being, because it has a big brain, rather than saying, well, it's because it's alive. Both are true. It's both true that a living human is alive and has a big brain. And it's a choice to say that the causality of bringing it into existence is the brain. And then that leads to this mystery, because in multiple ways, it's kind of like, if you think that everything else the body does is mere mechanism that doesn't require experience, then if every other living thing can move around, avoid pain, solve problems without any experience, then you've kind of, living things can look like they feel their way through the world, and we have this subjective experience of feeling. And I think they're two sides of the same coin. What Descartes did was try and rip one of those sides of the coin off and say, no, they're just clockwork automatons. We have this inner world. And now scientists are trying to glue the coin back together without letting it generalize to other living things. That metaphor fell apart there.
Oh man, you just killed off one of my heroes. It was so heartbreaking to hear that story. I've never heard that one before.
I mean, he's done amazing contributions, but I don't know if I want to bear with him.
I appreciate that I'm no longer the only person that kills off Shiloh's heroes, so thank you for that.
One by one.
I struggle with this because it seems like such a deeply unexamined conclusion. Like we've talked to people that are, for example, we talked to a guy, I think we never released this episode, so I find it funny to always relate back to it, but we talked to this guy, Brett Kagan from Cortical Labs.
It is actually on Spotify. It is not on YouTube. It is on Spotify, if anybody wants to check it out. Dishmind.
Interesting. Dishbrain, yeah. So they basically developed a system using a lot of Carl Friston's ideas, where they were able to grow neurons on a computer chip that was able to stimulate them and teach it to play Pong on the basis of expected versus unexpected stimuli. And so if it moved the paddle to the right place, it got a good stimulus. If it moved the paddle to the wrong place, they basically just gave it like a tiny electroshock, which down to the very foundational places of neuroscience evokes this picture of Descartes torturing the dog in order to be able to figure it out. But that, whatever, like that's the way that we figure things out. So it just struck me that in that conversation, he was like, well, obviously my cat's not conscious. And And this is a person who is operating in this world, designing tools at an extraordinarily high level, and yet has broken the continuum of life so fully. And maybe this reflects onto what you're saying about the fact that, well, we had to break it in order to be able to do what we did. And I'm still perplexed when it's philosophers who are not building machines, who are spending time thinking about nature and the world and animals, and yet they still come to this conclusion. And and they're still certain of it, right? Like the thought experiment of the philosophical zombie. Like, what would it be like? Could you tell that somebody doesn't have internal experience if they're acting like they have internal experience? And that's an unfathomable situation. And yet it's treated as a legitimate thought experiment where it might be possible that that's how living beings operate in the world.
Yeah, so what we spoke about earlier with the dynamics of life and niche construction, the way that knowledge is accumulated in the form of living organisms is through evolution. Kind of like, it can't get God's eye view and come up with a perfect solution, so it just kind of finds where it is, finds what Stuart Kaufman has called the adjacent possible, ways of being that are kind of next door to where they are, and they kind of worm their way to discover how to be. Science works by exactly the same algorithm, and so collections of humans gathering knowledge through science are rarely going to the structure of it isn't that they zoom out, take a snapshot of a God's eye view and go, oh, we should go way over here. There's a kind of built into our cognitive processes, there is this kind of conservative bias, you could say, which, makes sense because it's like what's been working so far, presumably we're onto some, good track, as opposed to if we took a random guess and started again from scratch. A giraffe's neck is a good fit for its environment. If it were to take a gamble and just have a random length neck, but most likely it won't go well, right? So I think that's part of the kind of inherent it's ironic because the picture I'm describing is like our very nature as living things, and as things with brains and as things that do science and philosophy, it's all the same algorithm. And that algorithm, has this bias towards conservatism and not making radical leaps. And so I think when this also just shows up in the way that humans are fallible social animals, and you think of like what happened to Galileo or Darwin, the kind of images mocking him for his ideas, both of which challenge human exceptionalism. I'm not putting myself in the same tier, but there's this thing where humans like the comfort of feeling like we're special. Either our planet's at the center of the universe, or we're different to other animals. And both these thinkers showed that neither of those were true. And I think we just have the same thing with consciousness. It just feels, socially, it feels better, I think, to people to sit around and go, gosh, aren't we amazing? We must, like, our brains must be like supercomputers to be able to do this. This is awesome, isn't it? Instead of saying, man, we're really like just this thing that's feeling its way out in the world. We're kind of like a worm, like if that's it just doesn't have it doesn't feel as fun, or as rewarding, to have that analogy.
It's funny how specialness and supremacy get conflated in these conversations, because I do think each organism is special in its own way. Like, I think all children are each special.
Strange,
everybody in the class is special. Some are special in a less than good way, and some are special in a good way. And some of them are just special. But I think that it's possible for us to embrace our specialness as well, and even if we embrace our power in our specialness, how amazing of an organism we are, then we should also embrace that with that comes a great deal of responsibility for our future and our interconnected future as well. So I don't know where you get from, I don't know how people get from, even powerful specialness into, well, screw the rest of reality. That's a very strange leap for me.
Yeah. I think clearly we're strange and like an outlier, and perhaps even like we are truly at the top when it comes to our agency, our ability to control and to have an effect on the world. And I totally agree that then why not be stewards, of the planet, and then we can be proud of our role, and we can still have that kind of pat on the back of like, oh, it's cool to not be, I don't know, some like a vole or something that's just getting killed by owls or whatever, like, it just, but instead it feels like we're contributing, but it doesn't have to be in this, supremacist way.
And it can be the same way in social relationships too, right? Like there's this something beautiful I've seen in a few different indigenous cultures where the chiefs of the society will have a great deal of material wealth and power and so forth, but they're also completely beholden to the whims of the people that are backing them up, right? And so they realize that. So having all of this power doesn't mean it's arbitrary power, because they're still have their fundamental responsibility is to take care of the people around them. And I feel like from just a basic leadership perspective too, it's like if you task yourself entirely with taking care of the people on your team, then you actually are empowered by it, and you're a more powerful leader as a result of it. Like you don't have it, there's letting yourself be seen as separate and above any situation is not necessarily practical or productive. That's what I find so strange about people who don't want to embrace that realization.
Yeah. I think what you described there to me is just the epitome of political sanity, is that, and it was very common throughout history, the sense of you can delegate someone to do a job, you can choose someone to be a leader because they're genuinely wise or skilled. But then if they become corrupt and abusive, and so, then you revoke that power. People have the ability to say, no, thanks, sorry, you're not our leader anymore. That's kind of what we've lost. And I think that's just on a political level now. But yeah, I think it comes down to the kind of ego, like, and the kind of psychopathy thing of like, if I can be a corrupt ruler and I can get away with it, and then I can hoard power, but it's a kind of fearful, dead-end, alienated. It's the lowest common denominator way of being. It's the cancer's way of being, of like, I just need to survive and accumulate power. And you're right that like I think there's a better situation for everyone, even the people who are doing that. If we can scaffold our way to the more harmonious picture,
right? Because that can't feel good, right? I mean, you can't
to always
sleep
feel
well at night if you're just screwing
threat.
everybody over in your life, right? I just can't imagine that that's an optimal state of existence for anyone, really.
But also, you're like a mafia boss who's got armed guards all around you, and you're afraid you're going to get assassinated in your sleep. And like, I suspect those mafia bosses do not have like great blood pressure, and they're not just like super relaxed and chill despite all their power.
Exactly.
I wonder though, because that leads me to a place where I'm like, I think that the people do have different preferences. I think that there is a really reasonable and rational way of encountering the world and saying that perhaps we should be more open to this awareness and to recognize our interconnected, or the interconnected, I can't say the word right now, interconnectedness of everything. And yet there's someone else who can sit on the other side and say, well, no, my role in this world is to win and to conquer and to possess and to use my wealth to accomplish things. And the crazy thing about the internal relationship to awareness is that you have to cultivate that. That's not something that you can just read a book about and all of a sudden understand. It's very much something that arises from the act of saying, all right, I'm open to this. And it seems plausible that there's just people in the world that aren't interested in that because their value structures are different, right?
I just think objectively it won't work out for them in the long run. Like even if you're like a terrible tyrant and all this stuff and you value conquest, you still need a team to pull it off. And you're right, like you can put all these pit bulls at the door and everything and live like that if you want, but that just objectively seems like substandard quality of life to me.
That's why you're not a mafia don. Do you know?
I mean, I think this brings us back to the same thing as the deep ecological humanist balance, but also like with evolution, Darwin was particularly interpreted in this very competitive way, survival of the fittest, domination, and there's an aspect of that to it in terms of organisms being invested in their own personal survival. And then there's a thinker called Kropotkin who wrote a book called Mutual Aid as a Factor in Evolution, which is a similar kind of inspired by Darwin, but making the opposite, contributing, saying that some systems survive through symbiosis. You look at the mitochondria in all of our cells that we seem to have been an independent organism, but they collaborated with ourselves, and now that's a win-win situation. So there's like an interdependence and mutuality, reciprocity, but that's not to say that differentiation, individuation, self-focus is not just a part of what we are. And clearly it's a part of what we are, and it's the part that I think is unconstrained at this point in a way that's unwise. So I'm not advocating we merge into some homogenous blob. I think some middle way between people, I'm sure there's a reason we evolved this way, and that there are real contributions for people standing out as individuals and asserting themselves as individuals, but that I think harmony is there when you're not way over on just that side of the equation leading things.
And harmony is so powerful. Like, even just from a musical perspective, it's really, really powerful. There's literally a physical relationship that you can mathematically describe whereby your amplitude is maximized by being in resonance with other tones that harmonize with it constructively. Like, it by definition is an empowering philosophy as far as I can tell.
To radically change direction, I wonder about something that you said early in the conversation, which is that we don't think of mechanisms like clocks as having internal experience. The thermostat on the wall responds to conditions, but it doesn't have internal experience. And we're living through a time where people seem really hell-bent on creating intelligent machines that will eventually become embodied. Where, you said, like, the clock can't look at the sky and have the experience of blue. And I'm like, well, it can't do that because it doesn't have eyes. It doesn't have any kind of relational structure inside of it that can take the light that comes in and ascribe some kind of meaning to it. But if you take a really, really intelligent computer program and you put it into a body that actually has all of the senses, and then like a clay golem with the little scroll in its head, you're like, go forth and experience. Do you not create a consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, you could take it even further because there are AI companies using the exact algorithms, the math of the free energy principle to create AI, which I'm sure will be very powerful. And you can imagine embodying that, giving it, as you say, skin sensors, allowing it to self-perpetuate, and that it plugs itself back in when it runs low on battery and stuff like that. Even in that situation, I think what we're dealing with there is a simulacrum, is something that's not the real thing. And the key difference there is that living things kind of pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. They're not externally designed by an outside intelligence, as far as we know. And I think the role of consciousness is the kind of the starting point, the anchoring to the world that allows us to self-author. And so we're like a tornado that kind of organically emerges through, the dynamics of existence. And then if I were to then describe all that and write the equations on a napkin, you wouldn't then think the napkin was conscious, right? That's an abstraction. That's a kind of a model of what I'm talking about. Now you instantiate those equations in transistors switching on and off. Still don't think that's conscious. You get all the way up to the embodied AI, you're still dealing with a very fancy napkin that's doing a really good job of doing an impression of the real thing. But there's this fundamental sense in which it's a simulation. Now, or a model, you could say, in the same way, that if you build a little diorama of a tornado, of like a tornado, you're not going to expect a real tornado to arise. So I think that's why there is a kind of fundamental difference. But if you could if you could create artificial life, make out of silicon, coax into existence the same way we're this like evolutionary dynamic, I think that would be conscious, because that would be showing the same dynamics. So again, even the embodied plugging itself in is not the same thing as at a thermodynamic level in a way that's deeply kind of physically grounded to be anchoring itself to reality. It would still rust, and it's not a living thing. It's an impression of a living thing. But there is a intermediate ground where things are so embodied with a continuity in the physical level that you can't say actually they're abstractions or simulacrums. That we've created them by imitating life, but it really is just life. We've just created life in a different form, and I think that would be conscious.
I think you might be right about that. I don't think that the systems are anywhere close to it at the moment, which is good, as far as I can tell, because I'm not ready for it.
Yeah. Most people their intuitions sometimes stall on this. I think a lot of people feel like the AI will be conscious. But yeah, I'm pretty convinced of the abstraction point.
I'm not 100% sure, but I have a hard time making a complete model of how it would be. I think that there is if you take the fundamental principle of life to be one, that a thing that perpetuates itself survives and a thing that doesn't won't, and then also that there is a certain number of degrees of freedom to what it looks like to survive, and that you have some kind of impulse to choose between the degrees of freedom that are available to you, whether that's because of this process of self-evidencing that you mentioned earlier, or it's because of some other mechanism. It still comes down to some sort of choice.
Creative potential.
Creative potential, yeah. And so then if you also give these machines the ability to make more of themselves, and then also to pass this set of learned cultural knowledge and ideas and directives into the next generation, I don't think that they would be biological life, but it's hard for me. I feel like we then create another hard problem of consciousness. If we're like, well, we've given them all of, they have the same number of, they have more neurons than we do, they have skin that senses better, and they have the same evolutionary directives as us, and yet they are foundationally different because they are created rather than evolved. But I'm like, if you allow them to evolve for, I don't know, 10 generations, 50 generations, and now they're far away from the initial prime directive, and they've modified it, and they've added things to it, and they have cultures, I'm like...
Yeah, I think if they could evolve, then that's a key kind of feature of life. So I guess a key aspect to this is how would they reproduce? If they reproduce by going into a factory and drilling together panels of metal and building something, that to me isn't a living thing that would evolve. Whereas if we're really talking about self-organization here. I guess I'm saying consciousness is a key part of the way that life self-organizes, and robots don't self-organize. But if you could build a robot that did self-organize, then we're talking about, you could call it artificial life, but I think that if it self-organized with the same properties as life, I think it would by necessity be conscious.
And the chatbots would be way cooler if they could self-organize information, right? Because right now they just kind of scan this body of information and tell you what you already know ostensibly on paper. At least the whole of the internet knows, or something like that. But they're not like reconceptualizing things. They're not like, they don't have that curiosity sense, right? They're not finding inconsistencies in that matrix and being like, hey, maybe we should investigate this or investigate that. They don't have that generative, creative. There's nothing evidencing that yet anyways. I agree that with you, Nastia, that if that starts to happen, then we'll be in a different game altogether. But at the moment...
Yeah. No. I mean, I think if we did that, there's a chance, like the kind of threat of AI extinction, there's a chance that because of this kind of simulation nature of it, that sure, it could like wreck the global economy and it could do all this stuff, but there could be a sense in which it's not going to actually jump ship and become embodied and take us all out. But artificial life, I wouldn't be surprised if within a day it's grey goo. Like if they're capable of evolution and they're like synthetic, and I don't see any reason we wouldn't give them, like, presumably we would have the ability to have them access like the internet, and I can't see a reason why we wouldn't do that, because then again, if they could leverage, if they're showing the kinds of Darwinian dynamics we show on a much faster time scale, and they have access to all the information of science, and they can modify that at the speeds AI work, then I think, that's apocalypse very quickly. So I'm not advocating we build artificial life in this form, but it may be our curiosity leads us there anyway.
I have a feeling that it will, and I have a feeling that it's going to be it might fail, right? There might be something that we discover that it's not possible to wire the system together in such a way where it has evolutionary instinct, right? Where I think that some of the ways in which we live as humans, or the way that the cat lives, or the way that the bird lives, comes down to things that are not necessarily explicitly stated. They're just these hard preferences. Like if we lived in water and we were octopi instead of humans, I'm not 100% sure that we would really ever be able to conceive of the physical world above, like on the ground. This is kind of the what is it, the Mary's room experiment,
right,
where it's like, Mary is a neuroscientist. She studies color, knows everything there is to know about rods and cones and that colors exist, but her world is black and white. And then when she goes outside, she finally sees blue. Does she learn something? And so I'm like, maybe there's something there about like biological experience that cannot possibly be transmuted into a machine that's booted without 4 billion-ish years of experience baked into it. Like, that's kind of my one hope as the moat. I'm like, 4 billion years, that's a long moat.
Yeah. And I think you might be right, and if I had to put money on it, I might actually suspect that we maybe won't make artificial life, precisely because life is not a bag of mechanisms. Living things are not objects. We are fully part of existence, and we are an emergent feature of existence. So to create it, you would have to coax it into existence, like creating a hurricane or something. You couldn't make a hurricane by putting all the atoms in the right place, then nudging them. You'd have to kind of create the right conditions, because it's nothing other than the movement of air given temperature. So part of the picture of this is this kind of new understanding of the thermodynamics of life, where life kind of is a continuity of the way that heat dissipates through from the sun onto our Earth, and then we're better at dissipating heat than non-living things. So that's kind of why the second law of thermodynamics permits us to exist. We're in deep continuity with just the energetics that is what we are. We're part of the energetics of existence. And so you would need to open up a new fissure in the energetics of existence, basically, to create artificial life, and sure, maybe you could design a place where you do that with synthetic chemicals, but that also may be something that's just really hard to do and to kind of, in a way that's sustainable. It could also be a selection effect where who knows if there was a situation where the first life form, maybe there were trillions and trillions of attempts going and going and going, and it took the right one by chance for Darwinian selection to kind of hack into that one. Maybe it may just be beyond our limits to do, hopefully.
Maybe time will tell. These are questions on the edge, right? Because people are definitely, the smartest people in the world are definitely working desperately on trying to make us boot artificial consciousness, and so we'll see.
Which is funny because I feel like they're doing it just to see if they can. Like, it's almost like the coolest party trick ever. But nobody's like, why are we doing that? Is that actually a good party trick to pull off? It's
playing God, right? It's like we're really special if we can do that. If we can create living, feeling things that can suffer.
Then I can finally love myself.
Exactly.
All right, James. Well, man, we've done almost 3 hours here. It's kind of flown by. I'm super
it's been really
grateful
fun
that you came by. It's been really fun to talk to you. Did you say you're in Portugal, by the way?
I am, I'm building a retreat center out here for kind of like if people are interested in meditation, but in a very sciencey kind of non-woo-woo way, doing that kind of stuff. I also have a website called innerspaceinstitute.org where there are some guided meditations if people have that orientation. But the book doesn't have any guided meditations.
That sounds awesome. We're actually going to come out to Portugal in a couple of months. I don't know if we'll be in the same parts as you, but maybe if you want to get a cup of coffee or something, we could actually say hi in person.
That'd be great.
Which part are you in? Like,
we're about 2.5 hours south of Lisbon, towards the beaches.
That's
from
not
the south.
too far from. Actually, I think we're going to go down there to visit Chris.
Yeah, I think that we might end up being there.
If you're on the beaches are all like an hour from us, which is a very easy drive, so that'd be awesome.
Very cool. I was going to ask, do you drink coffee?
Yeah.
You seem so calm. I was like, I imagine that you probably drink coffee.
It's because it's 10 p.m.
Well, we should let you go. There's a lot here to think about, and I appreciate you fielding all of our questions and giving us the grounds to explore this topic further. And I really cannot say enough how overjoyed I am to find someone who seems to see through the hard problem of consciousness. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I really enjoyed this.
Excellent. And everybody check out his book. It is called The Dawn of Mind. You can see it up there in the behind you. Oops. There you go. Sorry, we have a different screen that we had to pop up. But yeah, check it out. And yeah, thanks, James. We'll hit you up. We're coming out to Portugal. So have a great springtime. And thanks for coming by.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.